actually, most of them are within margin of error, except for the AKP supporters tend to actually have a higher level of support than undecided voters. But again, if we look at the overall attitude differences between the three parties, they all are very similar. There is basically no distinguishable evidence from the Pew Gap survey that we can find that AKP supporters are less supportive of the West or view the West as a greater political threat. Okay, well, what about the argument that the AKP is more pro-Islamic? Well, here we look at 5 different questions. The first one is the same opinion or favorability question, but this case for Iran. And while AKP supporters do tend to have a statistically significant higher opinion of Iran than undecided, support or oppose a nuclear Iran. Again, very small difference. This is you're noticing a theme here, and this kind of runs throughout. Very small differences, differences that we're barely able to detect using statistical tools. How big of a threat a nuclear Iran would pose to Turkey? Here we do find some differences, but the main difference is that the JHP has a much higher threat perception of a nuclear Iran than the other parties. That being said, again, the AKP and MHP's levels of threat perception are nearly identical, and all of the parties have relatively large majorities of the political parties that view Iranian and nuclear Iran as either threatening or very threatening. On opinion of Hamas and opinion of Hezbollah, we do find that the AKP is at least different from the Republicans in terms of their opinion of Hamas and Hezbollah. But again, this is where a lot of times statistics can be misleading. If you're just looking at statistical significance of a coefficient, you might say, aha, we found it, the AKP is different. But if you actually look at the results, what you see is the main difference is between those who have a very unfavorable opinion and just an unfavorable opinion. So this is not, again, evidence of some kind of pro-Islamist element that's been developed among the AKP electorate. The other thing I want you to notice in all these charts is in terms of opinion of the various actors. The differences that we see between the three parties, small as they are, and even within the margin of error, pale in comparison to the similarities in terms of if you look at the proportion that have very unfavorable views of the US, very unfavorable views of the European Union, very unfavorable views of Iran, very unfavorable views of Hamas and Hezbollah, upwards of 80 to 90% for all political parties for both of these groups. Essentially, the differences are much less than the similarities, and the similarities seem to support what we have labeled rather generically autonomy theory, this idea that there is a growing mistrust of all international actors within Turkish public opinion, not just the United States or the European Union. So the conclusions. First off, we find little to no support for the suppositions of axis theory. If, in fact, we accept what has been said by some of the people we talked about earlier in front of the U.S. House of Representatives in a hearing that they organized last year, that the AKP is radicalizing public opinion, that the AKP is turning its back on the West, that the AKP is trying to form an alliance with Russia, China, Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, and all these other groups. If we accept that, and we accept their idea that this should be reflected in public policy, well, we don't find support for that. And that seems to put a big dent in this case. What we do find is that there is a general suspicion across all political parties and all demographic groups of international actors more generally. And this includes the United States, the European Union, as well as Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah. So the takeaway point, the policy takeaway point here. Yeah, I have to always give the general caveats that we can only work with the data that we had available to us. And the GAP survey, because it's meant to be a large cross-national survey, doesn't have a lot of the detailed questions that we would like to have to, well, for example, distinguish between different types of Turkish nationalism. And that's something that we'd hope to be able to address in future research. But to the extent that it does not, but to the extent that there seems to be greater evidence for the argument of larger Turkish nationalism and not much evidence for Turkey shifting blocks from one group to the other, it would seem to suggest that the policy propositions of Axis theorists, the idea that the United States should start sidelining Turkey on issues, that it should punish Turkey in some way, these would seem to be exactly the kinds of things that autonomy theorists we do find support for would say would be counterproductive. And that's what we'll leave you with. Thank you, everyone, for being here today, and thank you to the Senate Foundation and others for organizing all this.
Thank you very much. And our third speaker, again, is Ali Balci from Sakarya University, who will be talking about Turkish-Israeli relations.
Thank you, Mr. Cuthell, and I also want to thank the organizers of such a great conference. And before the starting, I should warn you about two things. First one is, this time is the time to sleep for me. That's why please don't be panicked when I fall asleep. And second one is that I prepared a PowerPoint presentation because maybe you can have some confusion about my pronunciation. If you have, the best thing to do is to look at the PowerPoint to have a good understanding. And why I'm going to talk about Turkish-Israeli relation. And of course, I'm not going to talk about the agreements, mutual visits of political leaders and other facts between Turkey and Israel. I'm going to talk about what is the role of Turkish-Israeli relations on domestic power struggles in Turkey. And I think I also assume that every participants are a little bit familiar with Turkish politics. Thus, I'm not gonna go into details about some concepts about Turkey. And I think everybody realized that last 2 years witnessed one diplomatic crisis after another in Turkish-Israeli relations. And let me give two examples such diplomatic crises. First one is, of course, Davos incident, and you know Erdogan's storm of World Economic Forum of Davos after a spectacular exchange with Paris. Another important example is Mavi Marmara incident and a brutal Israeli raid on Mavi Marmara. Flotilla left 9 Turkish peace activists killed. And many scholars studying on Turkish politics commented that the last years in those years, Turkish-Israeli relations went into an all-time low level. And I'm going to try to explain why this happened. And my questions are the following. First one is, how a predominantly Muslim country had a bold strategic alliance with Israel in the 1990s? And my second question is that, how the positive relations of 1990s replaced with a hostile and toxic nature of the 2000s. My argument is that foreign policy is just a strategy, it's mainly a strategy in domestic power struggles. And I'm going to use a theory to explain this dramatic change between 1990s and 2000s. It is Copenhagen School's theory of securitization. Let me briefly explain what securitization is, or how the securitization process does work. And you can see a figure on PowerPoint. There are some concepts, maybe you are not familiar with them. Securitizing actors are those who determine what are the referent objects and what are the threats against the referent object. And securitizing actors can define referent object and can decide the threats against the referent object. And a securitizing actor is mainly speaker on referent object and threats, and they make speech act. And functional actors are some kind of helper for securitizing actor. They help securitizing actors in defining referent objects and in description of threats. Facilitating conditions makes possible which referent object is useful or which securitizing actor is the best to make speech act. And this is called some kind of securitizing move. And if you want to have a successful securitization, you need to convince audience. Audience can be the people, a group of bureaucratic elite or military elite or something like that. And after you convince the audience, you need to have intended outcomes to finish the securitization process. This is my theory. I'm going to use it. And what about the securitization in the 1990s when Turkish-Israeli relation considered? And securitizing actor was the, let me say something about referent objects firstly. Main referent objects of the 1990s were survival of the state and secularism, namely the identity of the state. And who defined, maybe you know Hobbesian culture was very dominant in the 1990s in Turkey. And many policymakers believed that Turkey was encircled by enemy states, by threats, external threats. And secularism was always on the agenda of policymakers. And the military had a dominant role in defining referent objects and in defining the threats. Let me give 2 examples. In 1989, the General Staff pointed out the main source of external threats to Turkey shifted from the north, namely the Soviet Union, to the south, namely Iran, Syria, and Iraq, and later Greece. Another example is that in the 1997, the military declared irtijal, it means religious fundamentalism, as the #1 threat to state security. What is the relation of those things with Israel? In 1998, after the signing of military agreement with Israel, an unnamed military source argued that we are surrounded on all sides by trouble. It is critical for us to jump outside the circle of chaos and find friends in the region. Israel was the perfect choice. And another example is that Çevik Bir, then Deputy Chief of General Staff, said that the army didn't watch Turkey turn toward Islam and didn't allow Israeli-Turkish military relations to be jeopardized by Islamic governments. And what was the role of functional actors during this kind of securitization process? And main functional actors was media. And if you look at Turkish media circles closely during that time, you can easily realize that there is a concept which is 2.5 strategy, which means that Turkey will be assaulted by Greece from the west and Syria from the east and PKK from the inside. And this is some kind of threat construction. And media also was obsessed with irtija during the 1990s. And what is the relationship of this kind of comments with Israel? And a leading daily explained the 1998 military agreement with Israel by arguing that Ankara gained a huge advantage against Athens and Damascus by getting the support of strongest state